Finally, I feel free from a heavy burden. Starting today, my parents will be living with me in my house. When my parents passed away, my husband, Calix, took an unexpected step. He demolished our family home. As we stood in front of the empty lot, he said something that left me shocked. "Hurry up and bring the inheritance to our place." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What are you talking about? Have you completely lost your mind?" I asked, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. His words made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because I suddenly understood what was going on. Calix and his parents looked confused as I laughed. "Why are you laughing?" "Don't you understand?" he said, his tone sharp and impatient. I decided it was time to tell them the truth. "My name is Arden Jackson," I began, speaking calmly. "I was born the eldest daughter of parents who were just regular office workers. I have one younger brother, and we were a very ordinary family. Life was simple, but it was good." I explained how I had married Calix when I was 28 years old. We had 2 wonderful kids, a son named Kale and a daughter named Leora. Life had its challenges, but it was balanced. I worked while raising our kids, and before I knew it, I was 50 years old. My children were all grown up by then, living independently and building their own careers. It felt like the perfect time for Calix and me to relax and enjoy the next chapter of our lives. It was a peaceful and ordinary life, and I thought it would continue that way. But everything changed one winter day. My father was in a car accident and passed away suddenly. He was only 66 years old. Our family was overwhelmed with grief. It hit us hard, but it was especially devastating for my mother. She became so depressed that she couldn't even eat. "Mom, I know it's hard, but you have to eat something," I urged her, trying to help her cope. "I know," she replied weakly, "but I just don't have any appetite. It feels like there's a heavy weight in my chest." At first, my brother and I thought it was just her way of grieving. We gave her time, thinking she'd start to recover on her own. But she didn't. Within just 3 weeks, she had lost a shocking amount of weight. I became worried and decided to take her to the hospital for a checkup. The doctor's diagnosis was devastating: cancer. Not only that, but the cancer was already at an advanced stage. Surgery wasn't an option, and she was given about a year to live. I felt crushed. I had barely begun to process my father's death, and now I was losing my mother too. It was unbearable to think about. I hadn't even had the chance to properly take care of my parents yet, and now time was running out. But I couldn't afford to let grief consume me. I had to step up for my mother's sake. My brother lived far away and couldn't provide much help, so the responsibility fell on me. I told Calix that I wanted my mother to move in with us, so I could care for her during her illness. But Calix's reaction was far from supportive. "We just finished dealing with your dad's funeral," he said, clearly annoyed. "And now I'm supposed to deal with more of your family's problems?" "You don't have to say it like that," I replied, feeling hurt by his tone. "Can't you just drive her to her doctor's appointments?" "Do we really need to live with her?" he added, his frustration obvious. I tried to explain. "She's going to feel lonely, and I want to be there for her. If it's really a problem, I could stay at my parents' house for a while instead." But this suggestion only made Calix angrier. "And who's going to take care of me while you're gone? Who's going to cook my meals?
"Who's going to do the laundry?" he demanded.
His reaction left me speechless. I wanted to help my mother during what little time she had left, but Calix made me feel like I was being selfish for even asking. I knew my mother, being kind and considerate, would probably insist that I not inconvenience Calix. But I couldn't just abandon her when she needed me most. Eventually, after a lot of arguing, Calix begrudgingly agreed. "Fine, but don't expect me to help with anything," he said. "Thank you," I replied, swallowing my frustration. I knew he wasn't being fair, but I was relieved that he had at least agreed to let her stay. So we moved into my family home to care for my mother. Calix and I had been living in a house provided by his employer, so we hadn't bought our own home yet. His parents had always planned for us to move in with them eventually, but for now, staying in my family's house was the best solution. It had more space, and we didn't have to pay the rent we were paying before. True to his word, Calix didn't lift a finger to help. He left everything to me, but I was grateful to have the chance to care for my mother during her final days. Although she seemed strong at times, she was often weak and spent much of her day lying down. I made her meals, fed her, and ensured she took her medication. She wouldn't have been able to manage it all on her own. "Thank you, Arden," she said to me one evening. "It's such a relief to have you here with me. And please thank Alex too. I'm so grateful to him for letting me stay." She didn't know how harsh Calix had been about the situation, and I didn't have the heart to tell her. One evening, after my mother had gone to bed, Calix came home from work. As we sat down for dinner, I brought up her treatment plan. But before I could say much, Calix cut me off with a glare. "I don't know what you expect me to say," he snapped. Calix's attitude left me feeling completely isolated. He had made it clear from the start, "I told you I'm not helping with anything." No matter how much I tried to talk to him, he refused to listen. All I wanted was someone to vent to, someone to lean on during such a hard time. I didn't even expect him to solve anything. Just listening would have been enough. But Calix wasn't interested. Months passed, and his behavior didn't improve. 2 months, 3 months, and still, he treated living with my mother as if it were some monumental sacrifice on his part. He constantly complained about the situation, acting as if he were doing me an enormous favor. His attitude wasn't just indifferent, it was downright obnoxious, and it grew worse by the day. Between worrying about my mother's health and trying to keep peace with Calix, I found myself under an unbearable amount of stress. Then, my mother's condition worsened rapidly, much faster than expected. Around the time we had feared the 3-year prognosis might be approaching, she had to be hospitalized. It was a heartbreaking time. Just 5 days later, she passed away. Even though I had prepared myself for this moment, it hit me harder than I imagined. I was devastated. Thankfully, my brother, his family, and my children came immediately to help with the funeral preparations. In moments like these, you want your spouse by your side, someone to lean on emotionally. But Calix? He was off in a corner, laughing and chatting with his parents as if it were any other day. He didn't help with the preparations at all, leaving the heavy lifting to my brother. Somehow, we managed to get everything organized for the funeral without him. During the ceremony, Calix's behavior became even more shocking. Instead of sitting in the family section where he belonged, he stayed in the back with the distant relatives. It was humiliating. "Calix, I want you to sit in the family section," I whispered to him. He shook his head. "No, I'm fine here. I'm not a blood relative, after all," he said casually, as if this was normal. I was stunned. "But you're my husband," I reminded him, trying to keep my voice calm. Before Calix could respond, his mother chimed in. "He may be your husband, but he's not your mother's son. Calix is our son, so he's technically an outsider too, you know. Arden should sit in the family section alone." Hearing her words felt like a slap in the face. I couldn't believe they were treating Calix, my husband, as if he had no connection to my family. In my hometown, it's common for sons-in-law to sit in the family section at funerals, but apparently, Calix and his family didn't share the same values. Their lack of respect left me speechless. To make things worse, distant relatives began whispering among themselves, wondering if Calix and I had secretly divorced. Despite my anger and embarrassment, I focused on saying goodbye to my mother. We managed to see her off peacefully, though Calix's absence by my side left a bitter feeling in my heart. After the funeral, everyone, my brother's family, my children, Calix, and his parents, returned to my family home. I served tea, trying to express my gratitude. "Thank you for coming, especially during such a busy time," I said politely. Instead of offering condolences, my in-laws laughed. "Well, it's been something, hasn't it? First your father, now your mother. These funeral expenses are such a burden. But at least it's all over now," they said, as if it were a joke. Their words stunned me. What did they mean by a burden? I felt my face flush with anger, but I forced a smile and excused myself to another room. As I stepped away, I overheard Calix talking with his parents. "It must have been tough for you, Calix, living with outsiders," his mother said sympathetically. "Yeah, dealing with Arden's whims was such a pain," Calix replied. "A husband shouldn't just follow his wife's demands. If you don't like something, you have every right to refuse." Hearing their laughter and casual tone made my blood boil. They had no idea what I had been going through, or maybe they just didn't care. Calix and his parents had always been rude and insensitive, but this was a new low. Even when we got married, Calix's mother had said, "Couldn't you find someone more attractive?" I guess I can't expect much from the grandchildren now. His father joked, "They say beauty gets boring after 3 days, but with Arden, you won't get bored." And Calix had just laughed along with them. Now, as I stood listening to their conversation, I realized they hadn't offered a single kind word after either of my parents' deaths. Instead, they had mocked and ridiculed me. For so long, I had felt guilty about burdening Calix with my family's issues, but now I saw his behavior for what it truly was: cruel and selfish. As I tried to calm myself down, my mother-in-law suddenly called out, "Arden." "Yes," I replied, startled. She was holding my late mother's purse. "Can I have this?" she asked casually. I was too shocked to respond at first.
"What?"
I stammered. "Well, your mother doesn't need it anymore, right?"
Calix suggested I take it.
"Maybe I'll just keep it," she said, inspecting the purse as if she were shopping in a store. I couldn't believe her audacity. Still, I managed to compose myself and said firmly, "No, you can't have it." Her expression changed instantly. She wasn't upset about the purse itself. She was furious that I, her daughter-in-law, had dared to stand up to her. But I stood my ground. "We're not ready to sort through my mother's belongings yet. When the time comes, we'll distribute her keepsakes among the family," I said. Her face turned red with anger. "What do you mean? Are you saying I'm an outsider?" she snapped. I looked her straight in the eye. "You're the one who said at the funeral that Calix was an outsider to my mother. So yes, by that logic, you're an outsider too?" Hearing this, Calix and his father also turned red with anger. "How dare you talk to Mom like that? Apologize right now," Calix demanded. Their shouting drew everyone from the other room. My mother-in-law, now furious, shouted dramatically, "I didn't expect to be called an outsider after all the effort we put into attending this funeral. Let's go home, Dad." She stormed out, and Calix followed her without saying another word. After they left, my family, confused by the commotion, asked, "What happened? Did you really call your mother-in-law an outsider?" I explained everything that had happened. Once they understood the full story, not a single person blamed me. Even my children sided with me. "Grandma and Grandpa should be more considerate of other people's feelings," they said. "That's just how Dad, Grandma, and Grandpa have always been." Their support gave me strength, but deep down, I knew this was just the beginning of a much bigger problem. I couldn't shake the betrayal I felt from Calix and his parents. Since that awful day, Calix hadn't come home, and I hadn't reached out to him either. I didn't feel like I should be the one to apologize, and honestly, I didn't know if I could ever forgive him, even if he did apologize. But I knew we couldn't go on like this forever. Then one day, Calix returned unexpectedly. "Welcome home," I said, forcing myself to stay calm despite the anger bubbling inside me at the sight of him. "It's been tough, huh?" he said, his tone gruff and awkward, as if he were trying to sound concerned. His words caught me off guard. Before I could respond, he handed me some travel vouchers. "Take the kids and go on a trip. A change of scenery will do you good," he said. I was speechless. Tears welled up in my eyes. I wasn't sure if this was his way of trying to make amends or if it had been the kids' idea, but it touched me that Calix went along with it. Without a word, I took the vouchers and thanked him. Later, I called my children to plan the trip. "Really? Dad suggested this?" Leora asked, her voice full of surprise. "Yeah, he did," I replied. "It's surprising, isn't it?" "It really is," she said. The kids seemed just as astonished as I was, but they were excited about the idea. It seemed like Calix had genuinely meant this as a kind gesture, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope. I packed my bags, ready for a little escape. "I'll be off then," I said to Calix as I prepared to leave. "Take your time," he replied. "Stay with the kids at their places too, if you want." "Really? I can't be away that long," I said, feeling unsure.
"Don't worry about me."
"I'll relax at my parents' place." Just enjoy yourself, he insisted. With that, I left for my trip. First, I visited Leora, who was thrilled to have me. Then, I stopped by my son Kale's place. I hadn't had the chance to visit them during the past couple of years while caring for my mother, so this time was special. I helped both of them by cooking and freezing meals, which they greatly appreciated. Mom, you should be relaxing, not working, Kale said, laughing. But this really helps. It's no trouble, I replied, feeling happy to do something for my kids. Finally, the day of the spa trip arrived. My children and I spent a few days at the hot springs, enjoying the peaceful surroundings. The time together helped me heal, both physically and emotionally. For the first time in a long while, I felt the heavy weight of caregiving and grief begin to lift. This was so much fun, Kale said as we wrapped up the trip. We should thank Dad for this. Just this once, Leora added with a smile. I agree. It was thoughtful of him, I said, feeling a small glimmer of gratitude. When I returned home, I was ready to share the happy memories with Calix and start fresh as a couple. But what I saw left me speechless. The house, my family home, was gone. I stood frozen, staring at the empty lot where the house should have been. I recognized the location, but everything else was unrecognizable. The home I had grown up in, full of memories of my parents, was no longer there. My heart pounded in disbelief. Then, out of nowhere, Calix appeared, flanked by his parents. They were grinning, looking oddly pleased with themselves. Calix, what's going on? I asked, trying to stay calm. Calix's sickening smile deepened. Finally, I'm rid of that burden. Starting today, my parents are moving in with me here, he said, gesturing at the empty lot. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice trembling. Have you lost your mind? Calix's father added smugly, your family home has been demolished. Now bring over the inheritance. Whatever you've inherited, it's Calix's now. It was then that I realized the horrifying truth. Calix and his parents had demolished the house, assuming there was a substantial inheritance waiting for them. Anger and sadness overwhelmed me, but I refused to let them see me cry. Instead, I burst into laughter. The absurdity of their greed and betrayal made me laugh uncontrollably. What's so funny? Calix demanded, his grin fading. She's lost it, Calix's mother muttered, looking at me as if I were crazy. Through my laughter, I finally managed to say, there's no inheritance. Not a single penny. You destroyed my family's home for nothing. Their faces froze in shock. What do you mean? Calix demanded, his voice rising. I didn't bother explaining further. Instead, I turned to leave. I'm not living with strangers. If you want to live together, you can do it without me, I said firmly. Calix's mother exploded in anger. You helped with your parents' housework, but you won't help us? How dare you? You wanted to avoid housework, and you thought demolishing the house would solve your problems. There are things you just don't do, I said, raising my voice for the first time. Without waiting for a response, I walked away. Where are you going? Calix shouted after me, but I didn't look back. I needed time to think and a place to stay for the night, anywhere but near Calix and his parents. That night, I consulted a lawyer. Demolishing a house couldn't be done so easily, especially when it was still under my mother's name. As I explained the situation, I learned an unbelievable truth. Calix and his father had demolished the house themselves. His father, who worked in demolition, had enlisted his acquaintances to carry out the plan. They had even rented heavy machinery to do the job. The travel vouchers? A calculated move to get me out of the way while they carried out their scheme. Tears streamed down my face as I realized how deeply I had been betrayed. But the lawyer reassured me. Calix unlawfully demolished a property that wasn't in his name. He can be charged with property destruction and held liable for damages. Let's start by demanding a formal apology from him and his parents, the lawyer said with a kind smile. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had been wronged, but I wasn't powerless. Calix and his parents would face the consequences of their actions, and I was determined to reclaim my life. The lawyer quickly took action after I agreed to move forward, sending Calix a legal notice for compensation. Just a few days later, I got a call from him, furious. "What's with this certified letter?" he yelled. "Oh, you got it," I replied calmly. "You destroyed my family's house, so of course, you have to compensate me." "Compensate? Are you serious?" "We said we were moving to my parents' place. I demolished a house that no one was living in. You should be thanking me, not demanding compensation. Now bring the inheritance and come back home," Calix said arrogantly, his tone dripping with entitlement. "Thank you for demolishing my house? Don't make me laugh."
And what inheritance?
"It's not even settled yet," I shouted back, unable to hold in my anger. Calix went silent for a moment, clearly startled by my outburst. I rarely raised my voice, and this was probably the first time he'd seen this side of me. The truth was, I had already decided what to do about the inheritance long before any of this. During the year I spent with my mother, we had discussed it together. I told my brother that I didn't want anything and asked him to take it all. In the end, he inherited all the cash and stocks. However, he insisted I take the house, knowing I was the only one who could manage it since he lived far away. We had planned to keep it in the family, either for me to live in or to rent out. But Calix had ruined that. "Here's what's going to happen," I told him. "Either you and your father restore the house to its original state, or you pay the amount specified in the legal notice. I was trying to settle this peacefully, but if you don't comply, I'll file a police report and sue you."
Calix panicked.
"I'm sorry. I didn't think you'd get so upset," he said, trying to excuse his behavior. "Of course, I'm angry. What did you expect?" I snapped. His excuses didn't matter to me anymore. I later learned from conversations with Calix's family what had driven him to this. His father had always wanted Calix and me to live with them, particularly because he had a soft spot for our son, Kale. But Calix had always refused, using his difficult commute as an excuse. His parents assumed I was the one against the idea, so to convince them otherwise, Calix hatched this plan. He demolished my family's house, hoping I would have no choice but to move in with his parents under the pretense of using my inheritance. It was manipulative and cruel. "I didn't mean any harm," Calix pleaded. "Please give me a break. Dad's sorry too." "If you're truly sorry, then agree to the settlement," I replied coldly and hung up. Calix kept calling and texting, apologizing repeatedly, but I refused to entertain him. "If you're sorry, just transfer the money," I messaged back. My childhood home could never be restored, but at least I could try to find some closure by holding him accountable. During this time, I stayed at Leora's place, trying to figure out my next steps. My brother and children were fully supportive. Although my brother was furious about the house being demolished without his consent, he chose to stay out of the legal battle, saying, "I won't interfere, but I'll help you in any way I can. Do what you think is best, Arden." Everyone condemned Calix's actions, which gave me the strength to keep pushing forward. A month passed, and Calix still hadn't paid any compensation. He had also stopped contacting me altogether. I couldn't stay with Leora forever, and I was anxious to resolve this quickly so I could start rebuilding my life. But then something shocking happened, something I could have never imagined. One day, Leora called out to me, holding up her phone. "Mom, doesn't this apron look like Grandma's?" she asked, showing me a listing on a flea market app. I froze when I saw it. The apron was unique. It was one I had made for my mother years ago.
"What?"
"That's Grandma's apron," I exclaimed. "I made it, so I'm sure of it." Alarmed, Leora scrolled through the seller's listings. The profile was new, with no reviews or previous transactions, but it had nearly 45 items for sale. To my horror, all of them were my mother's belongings. Dresses, jewelry, trinkets, and even her favorite kitchen utensils, all things that had been in the house before it was demolished. My heart sank. There was only one person who could have taken those items after the house was destroyed, Calix. Furious, I immediately called him. "What's this about the app?" I demanded. "App? What are you talking about?" Calix replied, sounding annoyed. "Don't play dumb. You're selling my mother's belongings without permission, aren't you? Cancel those listings right now," I shouted. Calix stammered, trying to come up with an excuse. I don't know what you're talking about. You think I'm stupid? Stop this immediately, or you'll regret it, I warned. My hands trembled as I ended the call. I couldn't believe how far Calix had gone, and I wasn't going to let him get away with this after receiving the shocking call from Calix. I couldn't waste any time. What do you mean it wasn't you? I demanded. Who else would sell my mother's belongings? I was furious, and he sounded panicked. It really wasn't me, Calix stammered. Then who? I'm coming over right now to get everything back, I said and hung up. Without hesitation, Leora and I headed straight to Calix's parents' house. As soon as we arrived, I confronted Calix at the door. Where are my mother's things? I demanded, glaring at him. I don't know anything about it, he stuttered, looking visibly uncomfortable. Tell the truth, Dad, Leora chimed in, her voice sharp. Calix looked flustered, but before he could respond, his parents appeared. Oh, Leora, you're here, Calix's mom said cheerfully, smiling as she noticed her granddaughter. Leora didn't waste any time. Grandma, tell Dad to tell the truth. What happened to Grandma's belongings? She demanded, her voice trembling with anger. At Leora's words, Calix's mom burst into laughter. Calix is selling them? That's impossible, she exclaimed. Then, with a casual wave of her hand, she added, I'm the one selling them.
Her words sent a chill through me.
My blood ran cold, and I froze in disbelief. Calix's face turned pale, and his expression revealed that he had known about this all along. Leora's shock mirrored mine, but his mother continued talking, seemingly unaware of the gravity of her actions. What's the big deal? She said nonchalantly. It's a lot of work, you know. I have to pack everything carefully and make sure the photos look good. It keeps me busy. She sounded almost proud of herself, chatting as if this were a normal hobby. Cancel the listings right now. Those aren't yours to sell, Leora yelled, tears streaming down her face. But her grandmother seemed annoyed rather than remorseful. What's the problem? I finally found a hobby I enjoy. Selling these things keeps my mind active. It's good for preventing dementia. Besides, I'm the only grandmother left, and Leora wants me to stay healthy and live long, right? She said smugly. Her audacity was infuriating, and it became clear that pleading with her wouldn't change anything. She didn't care about the emotional value of those belongings or the pain she was causing. Let's go, Leora, I said firmly, pulling her away. But, Mom, this isn't fair, Leora protested. I know, but this isn't something we can solve here. Let's go to the police, I replied, determined. At the police station, I explained the situation, that my mother's belongings were stolen and were being sold without permission. The officers acted swiftly, suspending Calix's mother's account on the flea market app. This ensured that the items couldn't be sold anymore. As we left the station, I called Calix. I had your mother's account suspended. You knew about it, didn't you? That makes you complicit, I accused.
No.
I didn't know she was doing that. Calix stammered, sounding frantic. I've already filed a police report, so you better cooperate with the investigation, I warned.
What?
We're family. Withdraw it, please. Calix begged. Family? You still haven't paid a dime in compensation for the house, nor have you shown any remorse. Don't talk to me about family, I snapped. His pleas fell on deaf ears. Despite my anger, I still felt conflicted. I had lived with Calix for so many years, and part of me still had lingering feelings for him. Sighing, I softened slightly. I'll wait for the money, but I won't forgive the theft. Return everything. And, by the way, your father doesn't look well. Has he seen a doctor?
What?
Calix asked, sounding surprised. I'm not a monster, Calix. I just thought you should know, I said before hanging up. Calix's father had looked alarmingly thin and sickly when I saw him earlier. His complexion was unnatural, and it was obvious that something was wrong. But his family seemed too self-absorbed to notice. A few days later, I received a shocking call from Calix's father himself. What do you mean by treating me like a sick person? Are you planning to dump me in a hospital and get rid of me? He snapped. I was just concerned about your health, I replied, trying to keep calm. Don't make a fool of me. I'm not frail or short-lived like your parents, he retorted harshly. His words infuriated me, but I let it go. Not long after, he did end up visiting a doctor and was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Calix called me, panicked. Dad's got terminal cancer. What am I supposed to do? He cried. I couldn't help but scoff. I don't know, Calix. When I suggested he go to the hospital, he told me he wasn't frail or short-lived like my parents. So deal with it yourself, I replied coldly. How can you be so heartless, Arden? Calix said, sounding hurt. Heartless? Did you ever show my mother or me any kindness when we were going through the same thing? Reflect on your own actions, I said before hanging up. Calix's father passed away soon after. While I didn't want to harbor negative feelings towards someone who had died, I couldn't shed a single tear. The years of cruelty and hurt couldn't be erased. After the funeral, we discovered his will. Surprisingly, he had left their family house to Kale, my son. It seemed Calix's father had always favored Kale and wanted him to inherit the home, even after his death. Though Kale was excited, I told him, you don't need that house. Renounce the inheritance. It'll only bring trouble. But Kale insisted on keeping it. Grandpa wanted me to have it, he said, happy with the decision. The inheritance taxes were significant, but Calix's mother paid them, declaring, he's our successor, after all. It was bittersweet, as if Kale had been taken from me in some way. Then came the ultimate twist. One day, Calix called me in a panic. Come over to the house right now, he shouted. When I arrived, I was stunned to see heavy machinery and trucks from a demolition company tearing down Calix's parents' house. Kale stood nearby, watching with a satisfied expression. Kale, what's going on? Calix yelled. Stop this. This is our house. It's my house now. Grandpa left it to me, remember? I can do what I want with it, Kale replied calmly. Calix and his mother fell to their knees, begging Kale to stop. But he simply laughed. Did you forget what Grandpa and Dad did to Mom? Grandma, you treated Mom horribly, too. Did you ever apologize? He said, his sharp glare silencing them. As the house was demolished, I finally felt a sense of closure. Later, Calix paid the damages and compensation with the remaining inheritance. Kale also retrieved all the stolen belongings and returned them to me. You always have me and Leora, Kale said gently, and I finally let myself cry, this time with relief. Calix and his mother moved back into company housing, becoming the subject of rumors. Their future was uncertain, but I didn't concern myself with them anymore. I focused on moving forward. Kale got engaged and invited me to live with him and his fiancée. Mom, come live with us, he offered. His fiancée welcomed me warmly, and I decided to accept, determined to enjoy this new chapter of my life. I resolved never to become a mother-in-law like Calix's mother and to live happily with my new family.